And let me first click on to say it's okay to be recorded. Okay. And so I think we're all going to try to speak about 10 minutes or so, and then hopefully have room for questions at the end. And it's really great to be here. To me, it's proof positive that in times of adversity, that we can still go on. No one would ever accuse me of being a Pollyanna and seeing the bright side of a pandemic. But one thing adversity is surely the opposite of, and that's complacency. And if adversity is not necessarily good, I really do think complacency is really bad. And I'm accusing myself of it because I think complacency, that's what the special collections had been fallen into in the last several years. We were used to going after certain collections and not others. And none of us, we had not taken any kind of LGBTQ content in. So I hope y'all listening are less complacent than I was. Maybe you're already all collecting LGBTQ materials, and maybe you have been for years. With us, it started in about 2017, and it was a great moment. Someone walked into the research room and said out loud as you can be in special collections, and said that she wanted to see the holdings that we had on local LGBTQ materials because she wanted to do her thesis on it and about historic preservation. We were thrilled that she was so out front by that, because generally if people wanted to do anything LGBTQ, they did it down on the down low and on the QT. There'd be an email from the professor, is it okay, can we talk about this? And it was really almost of something, to be ashamed of. So we were thrilled that this student, and we saw that a corner had been turned, but then we realized that maybe we were not up to meeting the needs of our users. If now all of a sudden they were going to be so straightforward, we'd have to make sure that we had those kind of materials. So we applied in about late in 2017 for a Gaylord and Dorothy Donnelly grant for endangered collections. And we did do our paperwork. We did talk about why they're endangered, but we did actually see that almost our return address would approve that we were endangered. I hope none of y'all are going to take offense when I say that South Carolina is not necessarily known for its forward-looking view on LGBTQ issues. There's still a lot of hateful laws on the books about LGBTQ people, and we're one of the few states in the union that actually lacks any hate crime legislation. If I need to prove my point, I'll just do two tiny little points. One, from 1712 to 1868, you could be killed in South Carolina for doing any kind of act of sodomy, which is how they define gay people. And then the other thing I'll point on is the reason for our title, South Carolina is so gay. Many of y'all may or may not know this, but in 2008, if you were riding on the London tubes, you might have seen these incredible posters saying, Key West is so gay, San Francisco is so gay, Miami is so gay. It was all these cities in the United States trying to lure LGBTQ tourists from UK over to this country. Apparently, there were also a few posters that said, South Carolina is so gay. The state apparently had put up like $5,000 for this. When the state legislatures got a word of that, they were apocalyptic. Or, they basically wanted to say, one, they fired the person that authorized the $5,000, and they virtually said that there are no gay people in South Carolina. There have never been gay people in South Carolina, and we do not welcome gay people in South Carolina. So that was really kind of stunning for us. So although my archives at the time did not necessarily start collecting materials, we did kind of put up a website called The Real Rainbow Row. And many of y'all that might have seen Rebecca and Catherine's earlier presentation this morning mentioned this, but this is actually just a very easy basic website talking that gay history really had appeared in South Carolina. There were sites associated with it, but we had not started archivally. We had started with a website. But then in 2017, as I said, we put our proposal in. It was funded, and then we created a two-pronged proposal. We had archival collecting, and then we also had oral history. histories. And so then Brandon can talk to you about the oral history part of the project, and Rebecca can talk to you about the archival project. I'm the dull administrator, and what I'm going to do is talk about the kind of impacts that we had, the impacts on us, the impacts we had on others, and possibly maybe to talk about if you want to do the same kind of thing, maybe you can learn from what we learned. And like I said, Brandon and Rebecca will talk about the impacts we had specifically within special collections. They will talk about the number of oral histories. They will talk about the number of linear feet that we collected, et cetera. But as for outside of special collections, the first impact we had was on our library itself. The collection development librarians look around and saw, wow, there were no LGBTQ databases at all. In the scores of databases that we offered our students, not a single one was focused on LGBTQ issues. They followed our lead. So our library now has 2 very large LGBTQ databases that our students can use. Students are now using our collection and the numbers are going up. Outside the library, we had other impacts as well too. And it's really funny that in trying to do our archival job and we started to document history, we really started to change history. We weren't just documenting the narrative, we were actually changing the narrative. To reach out into the community to tell the folks that we wanted to start collecting LGBTQ materials, we went to the rally after the local gay pride parade, and we got a table, we got a booth, and we started talking to people and saying, yes, we want your materials. Apparently, this is the first time the college ever had a presence at one of these rallies. The college got an incredible, great amount of good PR, and the last year that happened, the college did it without us. So the college started doing that too. We had asked marketing and communications to give us a new logo, and you can kind of see it up there too. And this is our webpage. And so then once we had a logo, to our great happiness and astonishment, the college started using that logo all over campus. And I wish I had an image, but there were little rainbow flags all over campus now with that LGBTQ logo, which had never happened before. When we introduced ourselves to faculty, saying what we wanted to do with our archival program, all of a sudden we were put into all these meetings with faculty, staff, and students. And again, these other things started to happen because of what was happening in the archives. All of a sudden, the College of Charleston, for the first time in its history, put forth a welcoming program to LGBTQ students. That had never happened before. And for the very first time, there was alumni LGBTQ alumni meeting on the College of Charleston. That is something that had never happened before too. So to me, that proves that the power that archives has. And watch Brandon and Rebecca, I bet they can lip sync with me when I go on and I start quoting George Orwell. It's a quote that I love to quote, and I think we in archives should take this on, because what Orwell said is that he, she, or they who control the past control the future. And we really saw this on our campus. As we started to document the past, we saw that all of a sudden there was a great LGBTQ future here. In local parlance here, the Gullah people talk about come heres and been heres, and we can prove that we had been heres. And so then we really started seeing changes going on our campus beyond us. So while we secured our past, I can't be a Pollyanna and say that we really have secured our future, at least the future of our program. We are up against basically a lot of constraints. We got a grant for $200,000 and we did raise $75,000 on the side. But I have to say that money has run out, and Rebecca is here through the goodness of her heart. We can no longer afford her. Our funding ran out. We did do a lot of fundraising in the LGBTQ community, but we have to realize, I think, if you're going to do something like this, the LGBTQ community, at least in Charleston, does not have a great history of philanthropy, of giving. And if they are going to be giving to issues, they probably are going to be giving to social issues, equality, and that kind of thing. It's, you know, so if there is a hungry student, a hungry homeless LGBTQ student, people are going to fund that more than a hungry archivist, for which I'm sorry to say. It's sort of a catch-22. You know, to prove to donors that you're reliable, you have to have money, but you can't get money until you prove to donors that you're reliable. And in times of COVID, our institution can't commit to a new budget line supporting our program. So while Special Collections itself and Addlestone Library is very, very determined to help keep our program going, you know, we still have to raise money on our own. One thing that we did as well too, to sort of ingratiate and work ourselves into the college as well, is this is our 250th anniversary. So the college wanted a virtual tour of our campus. And because we had collected material documenting this particular building on our campus, its important and vital role in LGBTQ life in the city of Charleston and even throughout the South, we are now on the campus's virtual tour. So we have kind of insinuated ourselves into, you know, into the history of the college. And so then now anybody wanting to tour the college cannot help but see that there are LGBTQ sites associated on our campus. And on this, we actually have links back to our webpage as well. And I'll go back to our webpage as well. But one thing I have to talk about other than money, another more frightening word that impacts a program like ours is the word homophobia, both internalized and externalized homophobia. And internalized homophobia, it's really another catch-22. No one ever said in the past that LGBTQ archives were important, so everyone believed it. There's a wonderful quote by a sexuality scholar named Graham Rabb who said, "At any moment in the 19th century, someone, somewhere, was burning the papers of a homosexual relative." And this did not stop in the 19th century. There's been a lot of straightening up in lots of collections. We've gotten many collections of gay men and lesbian women from their families who any idea of their sexuality, they all look like, you know, Barbie dolls. They were all completely neutered and nothing in there too. But what's worse than that is that we LGBTQ people ourselves felt culpable as well. Because we never kept anything in the first place. One, historically, if a piece of paper survived to prove that we were gay, we could be punished for it. And two, we didn't keep our materials because we didn't think anyone was interested in it. You know, the thing is that in 1981, the first Charleston LGBTQ paper started publishing. As far as we know, there is not a complete run of that serial anywhere in the country. Not even the publisher himself has it. That's 1981. But you think in 1732, the city of Charleston started publishing newspapers, and many institutions have complete runs of those papers. So we in the community ourselves, we believed our past wasn't important, and we were complicit in losing it. And a sad note, I have to say that some archives also have internalized homophobia as well too. I do have to say in my archival career, I worked in 2 archives where closeted gay archivists turned down LGBTQ materials and would not let them enter the archives. One, they either believed that the materials weren't important, or two, they feared that if they brought in LGBTQ materials, they would sort of be outing themselves. And outing is the next thing that I want to talk about next. And Brandon can talk about it with its impact in oral histories, and Rebecca can talk about it in impact of processing collections. But the interesting thing is, I think you may end up outing people in your collections themselves because you may not know that you have LGBTQ collections. We actually started looking at our collections and realized, yes, we actually have LGBTQ collections already, but the archivist, when they were describing it, whether they were too well-mannered or whether they were too fearful or discriminating, whatever, they left out the gay content that was already in our collections. And so we in Special Collections and throughout our library are actually looking through all our descriptives language to make sure it's not hurtful or harmful or prejudicial. You're not going to assume that the person you're talking about in the collection is white or black or straight or heterosexual. So you may end up already outing materials in your collection if you go back and look at it. And that may not make some of the donors or some of the, some of the family happy. And on the topic of outing, I have to say that all of us involved in this project, we've outed ourselves. Of course, we didn't ask those questions in the job interviews because it doesn't really matter. But this is not necessarily a rhetorical question. Does it matter? We have a very successful Jewish heritage collection. It's led, not uncoincidentally, I think, by a Jewish woman. The head of the Avery Research Center for African American History and Culture is an African American. We of all this team happen to be out, but that's not how Rebecca and Brandon got their jobs. They got their jobs because they were passionate and professional. And in the final analysis, I think that really is all you need. You need passionate and professional people. And I do know of some successful LGBTQ programs that are run by allies. But I do have to say that we have an oral history or an interview with the head of an LGBTQ kids organization in town who was straight. And everyone assumed that once he became the head of this organization, that he was gay. Who else would be interested in LGBTQ things other than LGBTQ people? So, you know, if you're happy with guilty by association, that very well may come your way. One thing that we learned too is that if people don't necessarily know their history, people in South Carolina have long memories, and they realize that the state of South Carolina has not been friendly to LGBTQ people. And because the college is a state institution, we actually were confronted with that. We have not gotten 2 major LGBTQ collections because the people are terrified. They know that we are a state institution. They say, Harlan, we trust you, but we don't know what's going to happen when you leave. Will the institution throw away our papers? That's a terrible position for me to be in. It creates schisms all around. It's not good for me. It's not good for my peers and stuff like that. So if you're going to start collecting LGBTQ materials, I think it might be wise for you to investigate your own institution's history to make sure you don't have a history of doing anti-gay things, because if you do, a donor may very well confront you on it and say, why do you want our papers now? So even though it's 2020, people might think homophobia is passé, but it really isn't. It lingers in the oddest places. Even in academia, some of the old stereotypes persist. And the saddest thing, I think, is that many people think homophobia is not that bad, or they do the theory of relativity. They compare one prejudice to another, and they say homophobia is not as bad as prejudice against women, or it's not as bad against prejudice against African Americans. I think because I'm white and because I'm middle class, I'm not always the best messenger to be speaking about LGBTQ people suffering and LGBTQ students not getting the best access to things. But you know what? I may not be the best messenger, but we have to think in 2020, there's still people out there who do not want to hear the message. I know I've been speaking fast and I'm trying to get to the finish line, and I hope this hasn't been too much of a downer, too much of a negative. But on the positive, I have to say, we really have opened up the archives and opened up our institution. And I think we've even opened up our city too. So many people now are talking about it that never talked about it before. So if there has been the good, the bad, and the ugly, I really do think it's the good that has predominated. I believe the bad and the ugly, and we do document the bad and the ugly. I really look forward to that day when the bad and the ugly only exist in Hollinger boxes and in folders and that kind of thing. And so then people will have to come to archives and realize, what? People used to be prejudiced against this. That's a day that I really, really hope will come fast and forward. And I think us doing this helps bring that forward. So as I said, I really do look forward to when anything about prejudice against LGBTQ people and LGBT collections is a part of history. And with that, I'm going to say thank you for listening to my part, and I will stop sharing my screen, and I will hand it over now to Brandon, who's I think going to start talking next, if we've got the order right. Is that correct, on oral histories?
Let me just share my screen. Share. So as Harlan said, my name is Brandon Reid, and I'm going to talk to y'all today about our oral history programs. I thought I'd give you a little bit of background about myself first. I'm actually not an archivist by training. I didn't go to school to become an archivist. I kind of stumbled into this field as an undergrad. I started an internship with the Jewish Heritage Collection. A professor recommended that I intern there. And I spent the last 2 years at the college, my last 2 years there, doing an internship with the Jewish Heritage Collection, or JHC for short. After I graduated, I went overseas and did my master's degree, one-year program, and I came back, contacted JHC for a reference for future jobs, and they actually offered me a part-time job. That job led to a job with the South Carolina Historical Society part-time, and then a job part-time with the LGBTQ Archives, which, working for the Jewish Heritage Collection, proved to be very, very helpful, because the LGBTQ project's oral histories drew really heavily from the Jewish Heritage Collection, and the success that their collection had in developing relationships and building collections. And having the opportunity to work closely with JHC was incredibly helpful in starting the LGBTQ Oral History Project. We were not having to reinvent the wheel, and that helped us in getting started. And I'll just give you a quick overview of our oral histories. Since July 2018, when we recorded our first official interview, we have conducted 74 oral history interviews and recorded 5 community events. Of those 74 interviews, 68 have been transcribed, and 25 are currently available on the Low Country Digital Library. And this is a look at LCDL, and you can see we have an audio file and a PDF transcript. And just to give you a little bit of background of what the process looks like of getting an oral history interview online, I think it's important to know that it is very time consuming, and it's not particularly cheap. For folks interested in starting an oral history project, I'll just give you kind of a very brief rundown of what that process looks like. First thing, and I think is probably the most important, is figuring out what the goal is. Oral histories are about someone sharing their story with you, but I find the most interesting interviews are the ones that dig a bit deeper, that try to ground the story into the time and the places in which the story is set. Doing LGBTQ interviews, we spend a lot of time talking about LGBTQ clubs and bars. This is because the bars were more than just places for hookups. The bars served as places where community gathered. There were safe havens, places where people discovered friendships and built chosen families. So we want to hear about these places. We want to hear not just the name and the street address, although that is important. We want the granular details. We want to know who was in the bar. Was it all male? Was it all female? Was it majority white? Was it majority African American? Was it mixed? Was it a dance bar? Was it a dive bar? Was there a back room? Were there go-go boys? Well, all of these things. We want to know the details. We want to know what the bar looked like, because all of that is important. And how the bars were connected is important. So these are the types of questions that I think we focus on. We want to place the interviews and the stories into, when we're doing them in the Low Country, into the history of the Low Country. So the other thing that I would suggest is find interviewers who can ask those questions. This is something that we ran up against early on, is sometimes getting people to do interviews who can do them well and can ask the questions and kind of weave the story in with these kind of the granular detail that we're looking for can be difficult. So that is something that is important, and it's something that I know just from my personal experience listening to a lot of interviews, a lot of Jewish heritage interviews, was incredibly helpful. And then just sitting in on an interview is very helpful as well. So after the interview is done, we have the interview transcribed. We use a third-party transcription service. If we try to transcribe the interviews ourselves, the time that would take, we would not have nearly as many transcribed as we do. And using that third-party transcription service does come at a cost, about $1.25 a minute, but it is something that is well worth it. After the interview is transcribed, which typically takes about 24 hours for a 2-hour interview, we edit the interview, which for about a 2-hour interview can take upwards of four hours to edit, for us to do an initial edit. Then we send the interview to the narrator for them to review. And I think this is really one of the most important things that this oral history project has done, and I know JHC does this as well, is letting the narrators review their transcript, because that gives them the ability to see if there was a name of somebody that was mentioned that may not have been out or may not want to be exposed. We don't want to out anyone. And that is, as Harlan mentioned, that is an important thing that we focused on. So giving people the ability to look through and say, you know what, I didn't mean to say this person's name. I think it's best if we take this out. We have the ability to go in, we can cut the name out of the audio and remove it from the transcript. And I think that has been helpful. It's also a bit of a pain sometimes because people will want to correct grammar and make themselves sound better. As I'm sure you've noticed, I've said a lot of uhs and ums in this short period of time, and there are a lot of them in interviews, and people tend to want to take them out. But we can't do that. The audio and the transcript have to match. The audio will reveal what was said, and you can't change certain things in the audio. And honestly, changing the transcript that's not what we do. Only when it's necessary will we cut things out. Once the narrator has sent the transcript back, we review it again, we make changes that were requested, and then we do another round of edits, and then Harlan does a final proof on the transcript. Then the description is written, metadata is done, and it's a long process from start to finish. The Jewish Heritage Collection at one point figured out how much a single interview cost from start to finish, from conducting it to transcribing and editing, and their number, it was roughly around $1,000 an interview, and that included the cost of transcription. So it is something to take into consideration. And just to speak for a moment about how the pandemic has changed how we do interviews. I think it certainly has changed and affected how we do interviews, obviously. The College of Charleston was nice enough to give us a room in Idlestone Library to conduct interviews. So we were able to conduct interviews in the library in a very nice, quiet room using nice digital recorders that with very no interruption. So that made doing interviews a lot easier. Now that we're doing them during a pandemic, we're either doing them over Zoom or we've done a few in-person distanced interviews outside. From working with Jewish Heritage Collection and their oral histories that date back to 1995 when they were recording using tapes. I've worked with South Carolina Historical Society's oral histories that go back to the 1970s, and they certainly were using tapes. It has an effect on audio quality. There's a lot of times those interviews are done in people's homes, so you get a lot of background noise. So in a lot of ways, in my mind, what doing interviews during the pandemic has done is it's created similar problems that we were confronting with interviews done from the 70s up until digital recorders. There's a lot of, when you're doing an interview outside, there are leaf blowers, there are planes flying over, there are all these things that you can't control that we could in the library. And there's not much you can do about that. You can't make a leaf blower sound better. So that is something that has been an issue. Doing interviews over Zoom, people's Wi-Fi messes up. All sorts of things can happen. But again, I don't think it's much different than how it was before. It's just, we've just kind of went back a bit. And I think oral histories are the one aspect of archives that actually can thrive in this situation, because we can do an interview from anywhere. We can edit a transcript from anywhere. So we don't have to physically see people, be in the same room with someone. We're not having to quarantine digital files, and that makes it a lot easier. And the last thing I wanted to note was we have a collection that was given to us, the Alliance for Full Acceptance Records, and part of that collection included a series of radio interviews that were done. It was called Equal Time. It was, AFRA produced that in 2006. In 2006, you may remember there was an amendment on the ballot in South Carolina that would ban same-sex marriage in the state. It ultimately did pass. But these radio broadcasts were taking place before the vote, interviewing members of the community and kind of getting their thoughts on it and getting their stories. And we were able to digitize those tapes, to get them transcribed, Unfortunately, with those, the audio is not available just due to copyright issues because of the songs that were being played and all of that. It's just the transcripts, but they're really great interviews. They're little time capsules from that period, and they really show how much has changed in a relatively short amount of time. That in 2006, an amendment passed that banned same-sex marriage in South Carolina, and now you can legally marry in the state. So I think they're really interesting interviews, and it's kind of a good segue into Rebecca speaking about collections, because as I said, this came in as part of a collection. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Oh, Brandon, why don't you just leave it? Okay, never mind.
So,
That's all right. I can share mine. Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Rebecca Thayer, and I am the former project archivist, the processing archivist at the College of Charleston for the SC LGBTQ Archives and Oral History and Outreach Project. So basically, I was responsible for processing collections, for doing metadata for oral histories, and for also, recording oral histories sometimes. So I want to tell you a little bit some of our statistics. So as of September 30th, we had 70 processed linear feet of LGBTQ collections. We currently have approximately 45 feet of unprocessed collections. 13 finding aids are available online, and we have one more that should go live soon. These collections include some of the biggest and most influential LGBTQ organizations in the Charleston area, including the Alliance for Full Acceptance, as Brandon mentioned earlier, We Are Family, and the now defunct Low Country Gay and Lesbian Alliance. Personal papers available for research include culinary historian John Martin Taylor, philanthropist and former congressional candidate Linda Kettner, and bookstore owner and World War II veteran John Ziegler. Our oldest collection dates from the 1840s, while our newest collection has material from 2020. So this is a screenshot of our LibGuide.
Rebecca, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I don't think we're actually seeing the slides that you're showing.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
That's okay. You might need to unshare your screen and then put it in presenter mode again and then share.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that got it?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So yeah, this is a screenshot of our LibGuide, which is kind of a catch-all for LGBTQ resources in special collections and at the library. So you can see we've got a link to our archival collections here, as well as books and the databases that Harlan mentioned that our collection development librarians have since subscribed to. So here are some screenshots of abstracts of our LGBTQ collections. So I'm just gonna, I guess, talk really briefly so we have some time for questions. Let's see. So one thing that I guess I would say when it comes to writing description for LGBTQ collections is that generally I try to, in formal finding aids, use language that people use to describe themselves, and not assigning modern terminology if it wasn't used by the people themselves. So for example, we have the Mary Jo Smith Fetzer papers, Fetzer was a graphic artist and worked in television in Charleston. And there's no sort of smoking gun in her papers, you know, a diary where she calls herself a lesbian or something like that. But her papers do include biographical materials relating to her partner, Emmy Van Dyke, including Van Dyke's high school yearbook and diploma and her family genealogical book. So I don't know if Fetzer described herself as a lesbian, but I do know, you know, that she had this partner and they were together for years. So I, in my description, don't assign the label lesbian. Instead, I would describe her like I would describe a long-term heterosexual couple. Instead of saying heterosexual television personality John Smith, you know, I instead described Fetzer by saying the papers include biographical materials, mostly photographs and correspondence, documenting Fetzer's leisure activities with her partner, Emmy Van Dyke, showing their relationship without applying a 2020 label to either of the two women. Researchers who are interested in LGBTQ history can still find the papers by their inclusion in the LGBTQ Collections Record Group and in our Archives Phase interface and through the link on our LibGuide. So one other thing that I want to point out is that a lot of these collections, because people weren't out publicly, the collection might not be about them being gay, but it's still important that these are the papers of LGBTQ people. If we're not providing our researchers with the contributions of LGBTQ people in our collecting areas, then we're not providing them with a full and comprehensive picture of that population. For example, if your collection on women doesn't include lesbians or transgender women, are you really comprehensively collecting about women? So when looking at our collections, it would be helpful to think what subjects in our collections are incomplete without the contributions of LGBTQ people. So partially for that reason, we didn't completely separate the LGBTQ papers from our other areas by assigning them different manuscript numbers, because we know that the appeal of these papers is not only in the fact that these people belong to the LGBTQ community, but that they had lots of other contributions that will interest future researchers. So as you're collecting, arranging, and describing LGBTQ materials, there are always new things that will pop up. It's really fun and interesting work for a processing archivist. And I could keep describing more areas like Library of Congress subject headings, specific issues with describing transgender people, and collection development and accessioning. But I want to give us time for questions. So I'll just say thank you all for your time.
Thank you so much, Harlan, Brandon, and Rebecca, for that great presentation. There are a few questions in here, or at least one that I see, and Jessica dropped all the links that you all had mentioned in the chat. So for people who are curious, those links are all there. Let me scroll up and find some of these questions. Dale Rosengarten asked if you could talk about how you solicit donations and oral history prospects.
Well, if Rebecca and Brandon want to, we first started out basically working our personal networks. You know, I'd been in the community for years, so I could ask people, but like Rebecca came to town and Rebecca she joined a church. She met a lot of LGBTQ people in her church, and that is the last collection that came in. So it's working those networks too. We started social media as well, you know, and on our webpage, we basically say we solicit your papers, we solicit your story. So it's basically been word of mouth in any kind of way we can get it out there as well. But personal contacts obviously are almost important, very important with everything.
I would definitely say personal contact. So A lot of times I just would go to local LGBTQ events, that the Alliance for Full Acceptance was hosting, or We Are Family, and introduce people, I'm working at the College of Charleston, we're doing this project, and not, the first time I meet them saying like, would you be interested in oral history? But, putting out there that we're doing this, getting to know people, kind of developing those relationships, they pass it on, to friends. And so we've been able to get interviews like that by being in the community, showing up to events.
Okay, great. Anyone else has any other questions, please drop them in the chat.
I'd be curious if other people, if they could put in there, if other people are collecting LGBTQ materials, if they could drop that in the chat, as a special area of focus, or they just happen to have it. I personally, if it's okay for me to ask a question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great thing. So yeah, if there's anyone who your institution is collecting, please put that in there. I had a question actually about, you talked about searching for materials that weren't identified as LGBTQ, but that did have materials in those collections. So how did you go about figuring out, were there, certain ways things were described that maybe made you think it would have those materials, or how'd you go about that?
It was again, personal knowledge, like the Mary Jo Fetzer collection that Rebecca had talked. It had been collected years before I was working at the college, or at the time, basically as a women's collection, that we were going after women's papers. I actually happened to know, I knew Jo Fetzer. And I knew, that Emmy Van Dyke was her partner. So it was that personal knowledge that then I could tell Rebecca about as well, too. We've also had things where people have told us, oh, you've got the papers of my aunt. She was a lesbian. And we would go and look through the papers and find nothing in it. But there certainly are things as well, too. If I can just... I showed that slide quickly about the site on our campus. John Ziegler and Edwin Peacock. We had their papers already. These were gay men who had been together for 49 years and had been leaders in the intellectual community. They were supporters of civil rights, and we already had some of their papers, and they were not described. They were described as book basement things. They were described as business partners. They were not described as as lovers, as emotional partners, even though their paper showed it. John and Edwin were out in the 30s and 40s, so they never hid it. It was completely obvious in their papers. But again, I just thought people were maybe being polite and thinking it was a slur. And I think that's one thing we have to overcome. It is not a slur to identify someone as LGBTQ. And I think many of us, like I said, we're investigating the whole archival field and not putting our blindnesses and our prejudices into our collection descriptions. So we can't assume everyone's white. We can't assume everyone's straight. And I think whoever described these papers before was just as a polite Southerner who didn't want to bring up the fact because they thought the truth was vulgar.
Thank you for that answer. Anne added in, it looks like there's a link to content DM for the LGBTQ Upstate Oral History collection. And Dale said, Brandon makes a good point about assigning catalog numbers. JHC decided at the beginning to keep our cat numbers in a specified range so they would all be together on the shelf. When we run into mixed families, it sometimes gets complicated. What are other folks' experiences?
I think that was Rebecca that mentioned the catalog numbering, but
yeah, just I know that it can be difficult. It initially makes sense to put all the same things together, but because I guess similarly with the Jewish Heritage Collection, people aren't well known just because they're Jewish. They also have other accomplishments in their So I think it's different ways of approaching things. Now that we have archive space, it's easy for us to sort of tag things under the LGBTQ record group so they can be intellectually all together, even if they're not physically all together with the same catalog number.
Okay. So we are right at time, or a little over time, but so if there are any final questions you want to drop in the chat, and if our speakers have any final remarks. All right. Well, thank you so much for this presentation. I know I really enjoyed it, and I've been looking forward to it since the schedule came out. So thank you again, Rebecca, Brandon, and Harlan, for teaching us a little bit more about this great project. If there are no other questions in the chat, we can wrap up. Looks like if you can see, there's some thank yous in there. And then our final session is the final keynote, Dismantling White Supremacy in the Archives and the Forest Hall Protest Collection at Middle Tennessee State University. So thank you, everybody.